Excellent. Okay. Welcome tonight, everybody, to a course. Here, let me share the screen here. It's been a little while since I've done a Zoom course, and happy to have you all here and all of you that are going to be watching. Great. Zoom has updated a few of their functions, so it takes always a kind of reminder to get to where we're at. Here we go. Here's the course. All right. What I'm calling lost cause politics, Jefferson Davis to George Wallace to Donald Trump. It is this through line, this very clear kind of ideological, intellectual, racial supremacy journey that takes us from the antebellum era before slavery, through the Civil War, through the Jim Crow era, exemplified again by George Wallace, who capitalizes upon these things that I'm going to talk about, these tendencies, up through Ronald Reagan and Pat Buchanan, to Donald Trump, who again doesn't create any of this, but understands it and capitalizes upon what I'm going to call lost cause politics. This is a lecture series that I put together back at the beginning of this year for me to help understand exactly what was going on and to talk about it and to think about it through this whole year. And having now watched it unfold with the demonization of immigrants, with the lies, with the outright sexism and misogyny, watched it unfold all year long, the white supremacy. I did a podcast a week and a half ago that I titled "It's Time to Beat George Wallace," and that's what I see Donald Trump as. He's worse than Wallace because he's actually been more successful on the national scale than Wallace was. So the series here, these three lectures tonight, tomorrow night, and Wednesday night, is this journey of lost cause politics, from the ideas that it formed the Confederacy in the United States, that then formed the massive resistance to racial progress and civil rights, and has formed the massive MAGA resistance to this diverse and increasingly inclusive America that we have today. There are through lines, and I want to talk about them. That's the goal of this course. Okay, so let me stop here for a second before I get started and just say, welcome. Glad to have you all here. Thank you for signing up for this and being part of this. Thank you for being part of this work for democracy. I'm fired up. I'm feeling really good about where we're at in this election cycle. It's nothing is won, W-O-N, nothing is won, but we are within striking distance of many victories. We have to keep working and keep pushing and keep doing all we can to make it happen. It's going to literally take everything we've got. It's not a cliche. This is a higher mountain to climb today than Barack Obama's mountain in 2008, which was like the third highest mountain you could climb, but now we're under the highest one. And it's going to take everything that we've got, energy-wise, time, treasure, enthusiasm. It's going to take it all. So thank you for joining this. I hope that these three lectures will further solidify our enthusiasm, our determination, because it will, I think, help us to see the larger context in which our struggles occurring today. Okay, let's start here. I want to start actually Friday, 3 days ago, October 4th, in North Carolina. One of the things that keeps me doing these lectures and these teachings is that the pieces that are present in learning, I keep seeing play out in real time. So I want to go to North Carolina, and this is just a screenshot of a Google map capturing what is the kind of American South, or a chunk of the American South. And there's a little red circle, or kind of circle, an oval there, right in the heart of North Carolina. It's just west of kind of Raleigh there. And I'm going to highlight it a little bit further here. And that is what's known as Fort Liberty today in America. And Fort Liberty is a recent naming of what was formerly Fort Bragg. And it's a military base in the United States. And there certainly are many military bases in the United States that support Army, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, Navy, and so on. They're all over the place, but they're particularly present in the American South. There's a lot of them. And this is the area now called Fort Liberty, previously called Fort Bragg. And on Friday, Donald Trump went there and spoke not on the base, can't do that as a candidate, but in the close by area. All right, so it's like speaking in just outside of Joint Base Lewis McChord, for example, just outside of Lewis. All right, and this base was named after a man by the name of Braxton Bragg, who had been a Confederate general. He was a West Point graduate, and then resigned his U.S. military commission to fight on behalf of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And he was not even one of the most famous generals on the Confederate side. We certainly have built deep mythologies around many of those generals, but Bragg isn't one that's generally known. In World War I, in the United States' engagement in that, they created Camp Bragg over on the eastern coast as a part of a launching point with other bases towards the battle in Europe. And they turned it into Fort Bragg in 1922. And it's been a very active military installation ever since then. Its most famous people there has been the 82nd Airborne Division, which is a iconic part of the American story of folks who have fought for freedom around the world. So Camp Bragg becomes Fort Bragg, and it's named Fort Bragg after this Confederate general for a long, long time. In 2021, the Senate, and this only requires the Senate, the naming of defense installations is only a Senate matter. It does not require a House action, House Representatives action. The Senate passed, you wouldn't call it a law. It's not quite a law. It's not really, it's more than a bill. They passed an act. I think that's what we would call it, in January 2021. This was when Donald Trump was still president. The Senate, which was at that point in time a Republican Senate, overrode the veto of Donald Trump because he had already vetoed it once. Overrode the veto. The Republican Senate overrode the veto of Trump, and they said that the United States needed to rename all Department of Defense facilities that were currently named after Confederates. This was a pretty darn big deal, right? And Trump vetoes it and then loses to his own party. So they implement this in January 2021, and I think there was about 15, 17, something like this, bases around the country that were then considered for renaming. It had to go through a process of considering new names. And in 2023, Fort Bragg was renamed Fort Liberty, which I think is a hell of a name, Fort Liberty, in 2023. But like everything around the Confederacy and American identity, it's a deeply contested renaming, and there are very strongly held views about not doing this. And so Trump goes there to speak in North Carolina. He goes to this location right outside Fort Liberty and gives a speech. And in that speech, he starts and then ends his time there by referencing his desire to change the name back to Fort Bragg. And so that's where I want to start this. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to share this clip. This is him at the beginning of the speech. Now he's garbled at first. He's slurring some words. It's tough to tell. But after about 3 seconds or 4 seconds of this, we're able to hear him really well.
That I asked, should we change the name from Fort Liberty back to Fort Bragg? First question. Right? So here's what we do. We get elected. I'm doing it. I'm doing it. I'm doing it. And we're leading in all the polls. We should get elected, but remember this, they cheat like hell. We got too big to rig. We need too big that I had.
Okay, so that's him at the beginning of the speech, doing his usual bullshit, and playing upon these, stoking and playing upon these divisions among the people about the naming and about the history of the location. And then here's him during the Q&A, right near the end of his time there.
The missiles flying into Israel from Iran and how impressive the Iron Dome is in protecting Israel.
Just a second, I want to make sure. I want to make sure I'm getting the sound. Just want to make sure you guys are getting the sound. I think I am, but I'm going to make sure. Yep, got it. Okay. So the person asking the question is asking about Israel's Iron Dome defense policies in Israel.
America.
I love it. I mean, I love it. How can you? I love it. We're going to have it. One of the things I say, we're going to have an Iron Dome. Why shouldn't we have an Iron Dome? And you see how effective. So the other day, 287 big missiles, ballistic missiles, were shot into Israel. Every single one of them was taken down. Well, why shouldn't we have that? And it's all going to be made in the United States. You know, it was our technology. It's all going to be made in the U.S., and a lot of it's going to be made in a place called North Carolina, if you don't mind, okay? And I think I just learned the secret. Look, we're going to win. I believe you got to get out there, you got to vote and all that. But I think I just learned the secret to winning absolutely and by massive margins. I'm going to promise to you, as I said at the beginning, that we're going to change the name back to Fort Bragg, because I think when that word gets out, I just see this great-looking soldier just accidentally said Fort Liberty, and he got almost booed the hell out of the place. That was not good. Anyway, I believe that
The missiles flying into Israel.
There is absolutely no way that Trump has the ability to make this happen, okay? All he can do is say the things he's saying in a divisive way. And what's he doing? He's drawing upon those baked in, racialized, regionalized, educationally baked in divisions that really characterize what are lost cause politics. This is just an easy, overt example of this to identify. Trump is doing it all day long in his election, just like George Wallace did it all day long, and just like Jefferson Davis and all the folks in that era set it into motion. That's what this lecture series is about. So that's Friday, 2 days ago. I want to go back to as we now kind of start into the body of the lecture, go back to December of 2023, okay, and talk about a very distinct moment of engagement that gives us a real window into not just Trump, but the MAGA worldview. Okay, so this is a statue. It's a monument, a marker. It's the kind of thing that you see on countless battlefields, in cemeteries, in spaces that have been decreed to be iconic. And on top is this person who's kind of holding a wreath of liberty, all right? Around the middle piece, you can see it right in the middle, is a frieze, an F-R-I-E-Z-E, frieze. And it depicts various peoples in there. And we begin to learn about this marker when we begin to read the frieze, to kind of walk around it and to pay attention to it. And there's stories being told in these engravings. And there are two in particular here that over time have drawn a lot of attention. The one on the left is a man who is manifesting what are kind of seem as clearly African features, whereas the rest of the people seem to be manifesting what are either clearly European or European American features, or just less obvious of any particular background. But this man stands out on the left in the middle of this space. And on the right, there is a woman who also manifests African features, who is handing a baby, a child, to a man who is a soldier. All these other men are soldiers. And she's handing him this baby. These two depictions capture long-held caricatures and stereotypes of the way African Americans function in the South, and particularly before the war. You have the so-called happy, gentle, domesticated slave person, this enslaved individual who is either marching or at least walking behind or aside these white Southerners that are going off to battle. So he's seen as with them. He's with them. This lie being told about him somehow agreeing that he's better off under the Southern mentality of Confederacy, or after that, the Jim Crow era. And over on the right, we have this image of what has been called over time the mammy figure of an African American woman who was in the home taking care of white children and is now happily giving back this child to the soldier who is returning home. And there's another child below her who is maybe hers, not clear, but is holding close to her because she's the beloved African American woman in the home to these white owners. These two images are deeply racialized and are part of the long told stories that come out of antebellum era about the ways that African Americans were supposedly happy and content to be part of a system that led to their subjugation. These two images are part of this frieze. So now we know a little bit more about this marker, that this monument has these images in here. And those soldiers are Confederate soldiers. We learned that too. Those are Confederate soldiers with these two images of Black people supposedly upholding the cause. At the base of this, on one side of this monument is some language, and it's not the easiest thing to read when you're first looking at it because of the typeface. But what it says is, not for fame or reward, not for place or for rank. Instead, by ambition. Let's see. No, yeah, I have trouble reading too. Not lured, like you're luring somebody in, not lured by ambition or goaded by necessity, but in simple obedience to duty as they understood it. Duty as they understood it. These men suffered all, sacrificed all, dared all, and died. So I'm going to read that again now that I got the words down. Not for fame or reward, not for place or for rank, not lured by ambition or goaded by necessity, but in simple obedience to duty as they understood it. These men suffered all, sacrificed all, dared all, and died. This is a monument to these Confederates, all right, and to the worldview they stood for. On the other side, on the opposite side of the base, is some other words, and it says, "To our dead heroes by the United Daughters of the Confederacy." And then it's got some words that are in Latin. Victrix causa, Dies plusit, something, something, something. Okay. It's put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which put up monuments all over this country, particularly American South, for decades, between roughly 1890 and 1945, roughly in that era. To our dead heroes by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. What does the Latin say? Because of course I can't read Latin. So what does the Latin mean? The Latin means the victorious cause was pleasing to the gods, but the lost cause to Cato. In Roman teachings, Cato was the person who was the embodiment of the kind of civil, small r, Republican, learned, disciplined, wise, moral, noble leader. And so this phrase here, the victorious cause was pleasing to the gods that somehow wrought the North winning this, but the lost cause was pleasing to Cato. And in the Roman teachings, Cato, again, is the superior person. He's the one that doesn't win, but is seen as the greater embodiment of humanity. This is what this phraseology says on this monument. And if you go to the American Southeast, from roughly Texas east to the Atlantic coast, and from basically kind of south of Kentucky down to the Gulf of Mexico, you'll find markers and monuments like this in lots of places, okay? This particular one, though, is in Arlington National Cemetery. It's not a place that we would expect to find it. Arlington Cemetery is a place where American patriots and heroes of the highest honor are buried. So to have this monument, this wording, this set of ideas in Arlington is really quite a thing. And in December 2023, it got removed. Despite Republican desires, the Confederate Memorial was removed from Arlington National Cemetery in December 2023. After the Defense Department went around and changed names for military installations, they began to look at other things they could do. And this is one of the items that was eventually decided upon, to remove this monument from Arlington. Now, it's not in the middle of Arlington. It's in a very designated space in Arlington, but it's still in Arlington Cemetery. And it was put there in the 1910s, maybe 1922. It was finished, something like that. Here's what Charlie Kirk, who is just a horrible embodiment of MAGA Nation, had to say at the time. Now, this is what he said in December. Now, the Biden administration is going to destroy the monument this week. If they're willing to desecrate the graves of people who died a century ago, what do you think they want to do to their descendants? It's just classic lost cause resentment. Like, we're the victims, and these big bad Northerners or these big bad federal government folks are going to do bad things to us. And Clint Smith, who's written a really great book called How the Word Is Passed, wrote a great essay for the Atlantic when this memorial was taken out of Arlington. And he talked about Arlington's, the legacy of the lost cause being taken out of there. But as he says in the subheadline here, if only national memory were so easily resolved. You can take out the monuments, but you can't resolve the national memory. Lost cause stays strong, so strong in our mindsets, in our world right now. But this wasn't actually the end. When I did this lecture series back in January, this was the end. This was the end at that time. But in June of this year, the Republicans tried to restore it. They had a vote. They tried to pass a law, and it started in the House. So even though the Senate had ultimate control over this, they were trying to pass a law now to get this done. They would have had to get it passed through the Senate, but they couldn't even get it through the House. That bill did not get passed in the House. Little over 20 Republicans voted against it. All Democrats voted against it. But the Republicans, 184 Republicans, voted to try to restore this Confederate monument, because they know that the politics that they are seeking to further is entwined with the lost cause teaching and this elevation, this exaltation of a worldview that comes straight out of the antebellum Confederacy. So I want to talk about the lost cause. It's a phrase that probably everybody here on this Zoom or listening or watching it on your own has heard. I'm going to be back in 1 second. I got to go feed my dog. I'll be right back. I have studied and read about American politics and race and religion since at least the early 1990s, way too long. It's a running joke in my marriage that all the books I ever buy are about the past, and 90% of them are about the era from roughly 1830 to about 1900 in this era. The reason I'm so fixated on that is because it was a time of great possibility. It was a time of emerging moral clarity. And it was a time also of massive response and payback by white Southerners. And so there's a lot in this era that echoes to us across time. In this body of work, the lost cause as an idea is a central understanding of the way that the South lost the war, but won what's called the narrative, won the story about the war, and to the detriment of all people of color, particularly African Americans, and to the detriment of all of those folks who believed that there should be a potential for equality and opportunity and justice in America. With all this focus, I want to start this series, these three lectures, by going right at what it was the lost cause. What is this thing called the lost cause? Okay. And I want to contrast two ways of thinking about the words lost cause. The first way, so these are two different ways. The first way to understand something that's called the lost cause is to see it as two words that refer to one idea. So you really say them as two words that are joined, lost cause. That's how we commonly utilize these words when they're put together in our everyday American political kind of vernacular. We talk about lost causes. Two words, one idea, a lost cause. What does this mean? When you think about it as two words and one idea, the way we interpret lost cause is that it's a doomed pursuit that really never had a chance. It was a lost cause from the beginning. The Mariners are a lost cause, okay? Walter Mondale in 1984 was a lost cause, all right? We think of things that are doomed pursuits that had no chance. When we think about two words, one idea, a doomed pursuit that had no chance. In this usage, the cause actually is seen as a mistake. The cause never really should have been undertaken. It was a waste of time, resources, people. It was a lost cause. From the beginning, it was doomed. The cause was never effectively articulated and understood. It was flawed from the beginning, and everything followed from that as a waste of time, resources, and people. In this understanding, this interpretation, the cause leaders were wrong. They were misguided. And history treats them as failures. In sports, we have these, these terrible collapses by teams that were winning substantially, and then they don't make it, and it's seen as they were a lost cause. They were doomed from the beginning. We see it in politics. We see it. We refer to this way in relationships. It was a lost cause. Those two trying to get together. So this is the way we walk around on a daily basis in the United States in our kind of civic, political, educated space. And we refer to these two words together, lost cause. It's one idea. It's a lost cause. I certainly use this terminology whenever I'm pissed about sports or about some flawed kind of approach that the U.S. Supreme Court right now is putting up as a lost cause to bring to the court a certain set of ideas because they're just not even going to listen to them. So two words, one idea, lost cause. That's not what the lost cause is when we talk about the American South. This is two words, two ideas. These are separate words, lost and cause. Lost and cause. And they're put together, but they have two distinct meanings within them. Here, the way we should interpret lost cause is that it's a valiant pursuit, a cause. It's a cause. And it was in the face of brutal odds, that it was a valiant pursuit that was lost. But the cause was right. The cause was good. It was a lost cause. The lost is almost sacred in it, that you tried. So you have a lost, you did not win, but it's in pursuit of something so right, so valiant, that there's a nobility attached to the pursuit, to the attempt, to the try. The cause here is seen as noble, not a mistake. In the first meaning, the lost cause, referring to a doomed pursuit, the cause is a mistake. You should never even have tried. It was a waste of time. Here, in the Southern lost cause mindset, the cause was noble. It was profoundly worthy. It was courageous. It was sacred. It was divine. It was right. A lost cause is a cause that was noble and was right. And the leaders were right. They're statesmen, men, of course, statesmen. They're heroes. They deserve to be put up on statues everywhere and have schools named after them and have textbooks venerate them, elevate them. So when we talk about the lost cause as a Southern ideology, this is what we're talking about here. A noble cause that was a valiant pursuit that did not win, but in the larger ethical cosmos was right. And the people pursued it. They were noble. They were heroes. They're the ones that we should look up to. This is what the lost cause is. When we talk about it as an idea coming out of the Civil War. The lost cause is treated this way by Southerners. Their ideas, their cause was right. They did not win, but the pursuit was noble. All of this is further cemented if the cause is seen as lost under certain circumstances. If the cause is seen as lost in an unfair way, if the cause is seen as lost because someone, God forbid, don't even say it, stole it or cheated, then the cause is even more noble and it should be fought even harder for. So the reality is that the lost cause idea is cemented if the cause was thought to be unfairly stolen. So if you were to, for example, take a cause, wrap it in an argument that it was unfairly stolen from you, that it was rigged, that they cheat, that you can't trust them, that they're horrible human beings, that they're unfair, it's wrong, 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 that they're immoral actors, then the lost cause idea becomes not only seen as the right cause, the pursuit of it becomes seen as this ultimate crusade, this righteous holy war. And that's what the American South was successful in constructing, with significant help from many Northern leaders after the Civil War. They were successful at creating the notion of a lost cause. And then they also wrapped it in arguments about it being, the war having been unfair and stolen from them, seen as the North had too many men, that the other countries around the world didn't give the South a fair chance. All right. It was seen as unfairly taken from them. So as we think about the lost cause, there's kind of 4 dimensions of it that become really helpful to us. We can think about what's worthy. That's the cause. What's worthy. We can think about who's the villains, who's the bad people in this, who are the ones that did the taking away, who are the victims. We can think of them as heroes, but they were first of all victimized. And victimhood is at the heart of this, the belief that somebody took something away from me. And then what is the response I should have to this? So using the Confederacy's lost cause, we can go through this typology. What was worthy? Who are the villains? Who are the victims? And what is the necessary, according to the lost cause, response to all of this? Okay. Lastly, then, what are the methods that we should utilize to bring about that response? What are the appropriate cultural, societal actions that we might take to bring about the response that we think is appropriate? Let's go through these 5 pieces, okay? What's worthy in the Confederacy's lost cause? Slavery. Slavery was worthy. It was so worthy that John Calhoun had famously referred to slavery, John Calhoun being a South Carolina senator, also a vice president for a period of time, and he was seen as the leader of the Southern senators and the kind of most fiercest advocate for slavery. He called slavery a positive good, that the value of it outweighed the downsides, that it was good, as he said, for America and for the Anglo-Saxons, and it was good for the Africans who, in his view, had somehow benefited from this. He called it a positive good. So in the lost cause, as it's enacted by the Confederacy, the piece that's worthy is slavery. Who are the villains? That's an easy one. It's the Northerners, especially Lincoln. They're the ones who are the villains in this story. That's why it's called the War of Northern Aggression. Okay, it's the War of Northern Aggression because they're the bad guys. Who are the victims? Of course, it's Southern whites, but it's also Southern Christian whites, and this is almost tautological. It's almost doesn't need to be said. The notion that they were Christian. If you're Southern and white in this era, then you are almost certainly Christian. If you are Southern and Christian, then you are almost certainly white if you were free. Okay? So the victims here were Southern Christian whites. The villains were the Northerners. And what were those victims doing? They were just trying to uphold this slavery, this positive good. What's the response that the Southern whites have to being victimized like this? For them, they decide that what's essential is to restore white power. We got to restore white power to the American South, ideally to the nation, and it's got to be restored. And so that's what they set out to do. After living through about 5 to 7 or 8 years, depending upon which state we're talking about here, of the rise of African Americans and the beginnings of a potential multiracial democracy, white Southerners take it into their hands to restore their power. Just like we think of the restoration in English history as the restoring of certain people to the crown. This is the restoration of white Southerners. They called it redemption, white redemption. as redeeming the America generally, and especially the white South. And the methods to get that restoration or that redemption done, well, the methods were whatever it took. Violence and disfranchisement were the two most in common. Violence, the killing, what the Equal Justice Initiative is called the Age of Terror, the age of lynching and terror, and disfranchisement, the removal of the right to vote for most African American men across the South. These two methods were the methods by which white power was restored to those victims who were Southern Christian whites. Even though those Northerners, the bad guys in all of this, had won the war, they could not sustain it, and they walked away from this in the American South. This is what we'll call the reality of the Confederacy. This is the cause that when they talk about the lost cause, they're referencing. So it's like a I don't know. I like to use metaphors. So what metaphor would I use here? It's like the genuineness. This is the genuineness, the authentic lost cause. That like when you look at it, this is what actually was what they believed should be restored. They believe that these methods were the appropriate methods. They did all this. This is genuine. This is actually it. That's the truth, the reality. But after the Civil War, the South made a couple tweaks to all of this, and they created what we can call the narrative. And the narrative has got deep alignment with the reality, but it's slightly modified in ways that becomes politically very potent and carries through to today. The narrative. So the reality are these things here. The narrative has to line up with it, but isn't quite the same thing. It can't contradict it, but it isn't exactly the same. Here, what was worthy for the former Southern states was their sovereignty, was their ability to have their own control of their states and their citizens. So the rearticulation of slavery as not the thing, but the actual thing was just having states control, what later will come to be called states' rights, the ability to have control of their own states. It enacts the slavery, but it is much more politically palatable in the American and the world, the global discourse as a phenomenon. States' sovereignty, the ability for states to make their own choices separate from a federal government. That's what's worthy. And that's the hill that the South will fight upon ever since the Civil War. They will fight upon states' rights and sovereignty all the time, built upon this foundation of the sovereignty to do what? To enact slavery. The villains in this story are not exactly just Northerners. Now they're the federal government. It's the same people, because the Northerners were really the federal government, and Lincoln was certainly the president. But Southerners got to move this around a little bit because they don't want to be at constant battle with Northerners, because there needs to be economic relationships rebuilt. And so they begin to focus on a distinct entity that was represented in Lincoln and those Northerners, and that's the federal government. Who's the bad people here? The federal government. They are the tyrannical bad people. And so they are the ones that are the villains. They are trying to tell these sovereign states what to do. All of this aligns very nicely with the reality, but it avoids the language around slavery, and it avoids the outright regional conflict. Who are the victims? Now the victims are not specifically Southern Christian whites, because you want to move it again out of the overt racialism, and you want to move it to what we call heritage or tradition or ways of life. It's just Southern heritages. It's just the ways it was, what sociologists have long called folkways, the ways in which people live and act. Power is crucial in this, but it's often obscured. We just talk about the customs and the ways that people live. Here, this is the victim. This is what those tyrannical federal government folks stole from those sovereign states, was the heritage, the tradition, the ways of life. What heritage, what tradition, what ways of life are we talking about here? Well, of course, slavery is one of those, but it's not the one that we're talking about right now in the Southern narrative. The narrative is just about good old tradition. Ways that men are men and women are women and whites are white and have their rightful place in power. It's about these traditions, these ways of life. What's the necessary response in the narrative? The narrative is not about restoring white power. It's about individual freedoms, that everybody should be able to do what they want. And if certain people rise up and take power, so be it. So if everybody has freedoms, individual freedoms, and certain people, certain clusters of people gain power, that's not because there's a system that made it so. It's because they had individual freedoms, which are right and good, and the federal government should not try to take them away. And so white power is restored, it is. But in this case, individual freedoms are the thing that were the higher calling, and white power just came out of it. And what's the methods? The methods are forever resistance to the federal government by whatever means are necessary. Violence, yes. Disfranchisement, yes. Or massive resistance where you just don't uphold laws anymore from the federal government, yes. Freedom riders get a Supreme Court decision that says you have to desegregate interstate bus commerce. The South just says we'll ignore it. We won't do it. We will resist. So forever resistance to the federal government, which includes violence and disfranchisement, but also includes a host of everyday mechanisms of just refusing that tyrannical federal government. So we got the reality over here, and we've got the narrative here, and it's in one of the greatest deceptions and strategic rhetorical maneuvers that this country has ever been in and has participated in. The narrative becomes widespread and adopted as a covering for the reality. And there's a denial of the reality underneath, even though everybody sees it. Everybody knows it's there. But the plausible response always is the narrative. All we care about here is sovereignty, states' rights. The federal government is bad, bad, bad. All we're trying to do here is protect our traditions, our ways of life. What's good here? Freedoms. It's the American way, individual freedoms. Yes, some people are going to rise up and have power. They are. That's part of what comes with individual freedoms. And we will forever resist the federal government. Absolutely. We will do it always, because by whatever means are necessary, we will make sure that we have restored white power, which we're calling individual freedoms. As a communications person, as somebody who studies American politics, it is a brilliant wrapping, like a present, like you wrap a present. It's a brilliant wrapping. What's inside the wrapping is this reality. What's on the outside is the narrative, and the narrative is available at all times for people who want to tap into this energy of the federal government doing the wrong thing, like renaming military bases. And we will forever resist. In fact, we're going to change it back if I elected. Why? Because this is Fort Bragg. It's a way of life. You've been referring to Fort Bragg for decades. We know it's tradition here. That narrative is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this course, because this narrative is available as a wrapping paper for any sophisticated politician who wants to come along and utilize it to their advantage. There's no more powerful moment to do that than in the midst of grand social change, when African Americans are making progress in this country, such as in the middle of the modern civil rights movement, such as with Barack Obama's election. That's when the wrapping paper becomes very, very appealing beyond just the diehard believers. Okay. Let's look at the language of Jefferson Davis in 1861, which is the day of the inauguration of the Confederacy. And Jefferson Davis takes the oath of office in Montgomery, Alabama, on the top steps of the Alabama state capitol. The state had become a state in 1819, and it's the first Confederacy capital. Eventually, in April, when Virginia secedes from the Union of 1861, in 1861, the capital will be moved for the Confederacy to Richmond. But it starts in Montgomery, Alabama, and Davis takes the oath of office. And we can see the way in which he has already, because he's speaking to the world with this address, chosen the wrapping over the reality, because the reality is just indefensible to be said out loud. So here's an excerpt from his inaugural speech. And it's got some of that mid 1800s language. So it's a little bit more bigger words, more complicated ideas than we might hear from a politician today. This is Jefferson Davis, former senator of Mississippi, now the president of the Confederacy. The declared purpose of the Compact of Union from which we have withdrawn was, quote, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessing of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's from the preamble of the Constitution. Davis goes on, and when, in the judgment of the sovereign states now composing this Confederacy, it had been perverted, that Constitution had been perverted from the purposes for which it was ordained, the government created by that compact should cease to exist. Thus, the sovereign states here represented proceeded to form this Confederacy, and it is by abuse of language that their act has been denominated a revolution. They formed a new alliance, but within each state, its government has remained. The rights of person and property have not been disturbed. The agent through whom they communicated with foreign nations is changed, but this does not necessarily interrupt their international relations. If, however, passion or the lust of dominion should cloud the judgment or inflame the ambition of the northeastern states of the American Union, we must prepare to meet the emergency and to maintain by the final arbitrament of the sword the position which we have assumed among the nations of the earth. Let me say this again. If, however, passion or the lust of dominion should cloud the judgment or inflame the ambition of the northeastern states of the American Union, we must prepare to meet the emergency and to maintain by the final arbitrament of the sword the position which we have assumed among the nations of the earth. We have entered upon the career of independence, and it must be inflexibly pursued. Through many years of controversy with our late associates, the northern states, we have vainly endeavored to secure tranquility and to obtain respect for the rights to which we were entitled. Last portion. As a necessity, not a choice, we have resorted to the remedy of separation, and henceforth our energies must be directed to the conduct of our own affairs and the perpetuity of the Confederacy which we have formed. If a just perception of mutual interest shall permit us peaceably to pursue our separate political career, my most earnest desire will have been fulfilled. But if this be denied to us, and the integrity of our territory and jurisdiction be assailed, it will but remain for us with firm resolve to appeal to arms and invoke the blessings of Providence on a just cause. On a just cause. 1861. It's the cause. What's the cause? The cause, according to him in this speech, is the sovereignty of the southern states. There is no mention of slavery in this speech. None. It is the preparing the construction of a narrative that Davis was engaged in here. Why would they bury the reality? Because the reality was so profoundly unacceptable, and they knew it was wrong, that they were necessary to construct another narrative. In the same way that we, when we do things wrong, are tempted to construct narratives that aren't true, but make us feel better. Well, Nikki Haley comes along, and in December of 2023, when she's still running for the presidency, and before she fully sells her soul to the Republican National Party, she's asked a question at a town hall about the South and about the Civil War. And she makes one adjustment in hers. She updates it, and that's why I turned these two in red, to a tyrannical government is no longer just the federal government that's tyrannical. In the modern MAGA era, all government is bad. All government's bad. And so as a result, it's forever resistance not only to the federal government, but to government generally, to these corrupt, rigging, cheating, lying, scandalous, the swamp. It's the swamp, okay? And to use Trump's word. So here's the language, and this text is kind of small, I know, on your screens, in which Haley is asked at a town hall, what was the cause of the United States Civil War? And Haley says, well, don't come with an easy question or anything. I mean, I think the cause of the Civil War was basically how government was going to run, the freedoms and what people could and couldn't do. What do you think the cause of the Civil War was? Which is the most pathetic thing, to see somebody running for the presidency to try to turn it back on a questioner. And the questioner says, I'm not running for president. I wanted to hear your view on the cause of the Civil War. Haley says, I mean, I think it always comes down to the role of government. We need to have capitalism. We need to have economic freedom. We need to make sure that we do all things so that individuals have the liberties so that they can have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do or be anything they want to be without government getting in the way. It's all about individual freedoms. All about individual freedoms. Questioner says, thank you. In the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you'd answer that question without mentioning the word slavery. Now, this would be a great place where someone could say, just like Jefferson Davis never mentioned slavery in his inaugural for the 1861 Confederacy. Haley says, what do you want me to say about slavery? And the questioner says, you've answered my question. Thank you. And Haley says, next question. You see, but when you try to be Trump and you try to be a man and to apply these techniques, the reality is that it doesn't work as well for anybody else if you're not the George Wallace or Donald Trump, who have these special kind of emotional, kinetic abilities to connect with people and to just outright lie with no shame whatsoever. So the next day, Haley comes back and says, let me take this one up again. Let me try this one again. And she says the following day, on December 28th, 2023, she says, yesterday I was asked, last night I was asked about the Civil War and what I think of the Civil War. What was the cause of the Civil War? Of course, the Civil War was about slavery. We know that. That's unquestioned, always the case. We know the Civil War was about slavery, but it was also more than that. It was about the freedoms of every individual. It was about the role of government. For 80 years, America had the decision and the moral question of whether slavery was a good thing and whether government, economically, culturally, or any other reasons had a role to play in that. By the grace of God, we did the right thing and slavery is no more. But the lessons of what that bigger issue with the Civil War are is that let's not forget what came out of that, which is government's role, individual liberties, freedom for every single person, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do and be anything you want to be without anyone or government getting in your way. That should be the goal of what we always try and take away from that, right? Because we never want to return back to that place. But we always want to remember the lesson of what it means to be a free individual and that everyone deserves to be a free individual. So we stand by that. I say that as a Southerner. I say that as a Southern governor who removed the Confederate flag off the State House grounds. And I say that as a proud American of how far we've come. It's about individual freedoms to be everything you want to be for white people. For white people. That's why the narrative is so powerful. It obscures the white supremacy within it. It absolutely obviates the white supremacy that's built into the narrative. Whose heritage, tradition, ways of life we talking about? We're talking about white people. Whose sovereignty we talking about here? Those white Southerners. Whose individual freedoms we talking about here? Whites. All right. And what's the government? Why should you fight the government? Because the government is trying very, very imperfectly, not as well as we would like, to bring about that multiracial democracy, and thus it must be fought against. As a narrative, it's extremely powerful because of what it hides and because of what it allows you to say to the world without being called an outright racist, okay? Without being called an outright racist. So I want to spend the last third of this lecture tonight by talking about the narrative, how it was constructed and how it was implemented, all right? The construction of the narrative comes out of the period of time after the Civil War. It starts with the founding of the Ku Klux Klan in December. Legend has it that it was the Christmas Day in Pulaski, Tennessee. And there's a plaque still there in Tennessee that honors that where the founding of the Klan occurred. The war was over. The 13th Amendment had recently been enacted in December of 1865, and the Klan is now going to be the redeemers, the folks that are going to bring about that restoration. That's the plan. That the military, that the national government can't do this. The Southerners need their own militia to make this happen. It's going to be those Southern whites that are going to make it happen. Doesn't unfold that way right away because the federal government is very involved and blocks this and eventually passes two Federal Civil Rights Act to break up the Klan. And they're very successful. It's eventually break up the Klan roughly in the early 1870s, the first version of the Klan. We have a second version and then a third version that ultimately get created. But the federal government's very active. And so the federal government becomes even steps into that role again as the villains. Now they're easily the villains against white Southerners because they're opposing the Klan in the South and they're protecting Black men's right to vote, just making the federal government absolutely the villains. But it starts with the founding of the Klan as the people that are going to bring about or are going to restore the lost cause. And there's a book. It's a little bit more like a pamphlet, but it's considered a book called The Lost Cause that's written in 1867. And it's written by a guy named Edward Pollard. And Pollard is a journalist. He's not a scholar, a professor, a theologian. He's not a political leader. He's a journalist, and he's writing some observations about the war. And he has when you read it, it's not very long. It's really a lamentation. It's melancholy. It's sadness about the lost cause, the cause being lost. But it's not aggressive. It's just really a sadness about it. It's from the perspective of a white Southerner who's lost their property, lost their status, lost their understanding of the world. And African Americans are gaining power, gaining the right to vote, gaining political office, gaining their own businesses. And so it's a lamentation. And this is a poignant paragraph. Pollard says, "No man can write the history of slavery without recognizing contributions and naming prominent results beyond the domain of controversy." So he's saying there's some things that we can all agree upon. It bestowed on the world's commerce in a half century a single product whose annual value was $200 million. It founded a system where starvation was unknown, where order was preserved by an unpaid police, and where many fertile regions accessible only to the labor of the African were brought into usefulness and blessed the world with their productions. The system of servitude in the South was really the mildest in the world. It did not rest on acts of debasement and disenfranchisement, but elevated the African and was in the interest of human improvement. White men protected the Negro in life and limb and in many personal rights, and by the practice of the system bestowed upon him a sum of individual indulgences, which made him altogether the most striking type in the world of cheerfulness and contentment. This is what those images on that Confederate memorial in Arlington Cemetery are conveying: the cheerfulness, the contentment, the safety, the being protected, the elevation of Black Americans under enslavement. This is the lamentation. It's a sadness. It's a like, look what we've lost. Look what we've lost. There is not a sense in this booklet that it can be regained. There is a sense of the sadness of the loss. It's a grief. It's a book of grief. But it gets a pretty wide reading. And people really respond to it. And so Pollard says, you know what? I'll write another book. And this one is about how we come back. And it's called The Lost Cause Regained. And this is a manifesto. This is a book about retaking power, overcoming the multiracial democracy that the tyrannical federal government is installing with African Americans, who are seen as, of course, less than human, treated that way, seen as not able to lead, not worthy of it, and every possible negative image that we can come up with. And so he writes the manifesto, and the manifesto becomes the driving force of the Lost Cause. And then Robert E. Lee dies in 1870, and they have the martyr that they need. They have the man who was the ultimate kind of mythology of the Lost Cause, the noble Southern gentleman who supposedly didn't want to fight for the Confederacy and supposedly did not want to have slaves, but did nonetheless on both counts. So they now have the mythology of a man at the center of this lost cause to be regained. Not only have they lost the war, they've lost their hero, their grave, grand hero. These four things, from the Klan through Lee's death, with these two books in the middle, form the basis of this idea, what's often called an ideology. It's a set of interconnected ideas that becomes the Lost Cause. Eventually, Jefferson Davis doesn't go to jail. If Jefferson Davis had gone to jail like he should have, then Donald Trump would be in jail now, probably. But Davis doesn't go to jail then. The Supreme Court is not willing to take up the case, and eventually Andrew Johnson pardons Jefferson Davis. And Davis eventually goes out and becomes a book tour. And in the 1880s, he has a very big book tour. And he walks around talking about how the Southerners had been cheated, not conquered. It had been stolen. That they were the more noble people. They were right. They were good. And they were cheated. It was stolen. It was stolen by these bad people from the North, embodied in the federal government. And Davis lies in state across the South when he dies in 1893. He's an American hero in the South's eyes. This is how the Lost Cause idea comes to be, as a set of ideas, and with people, it's wrapped around certain people. The people embody it. The people become the human manifestation of it. Okay. Now, how about the resonance? Why does the Lost Cause win as an idea? Why does the Lost Cause ultimately win in American life? What is it about it that gives it such resonance? Let me stop here for just 1 second. Just see how I'm doing here. Okay. I think I'm going to need to, I don't want to lose my power here. Where are we at? 21%, that could go. Let's see here. I'm going to just switch cameras for a second here, which will allow me to plug in my cord. You're going to keep seeing me. It just won't be quite as clear. I'm here still. I'm coming back. Here we go. Okay. And let me plug in my So I got a brand new camera. Charles bought it for me. And that's the one we're using, but it needs to be plugged into the electrical port on the electrical charger port on the laptop. So I can't be plugging in power at the same time I'm using that new camera. And ultimately, I was getting close to running out of juice, and I didn't want that to happen. And somehow this to cut away from where we're at. So let me get back here now and talk about the resonance. Why did this set of ideas, win ultimately? Well, this is when you really get down deep into a cultural psyche, into the kind of mindset of a people, of a group of people. And I'm gonna go into that depth, and I'm gonna connect the Confederacy lost cause narrative with the dominant Christian narrative that has defined American life for, its entire existence as a country, and to connect them. I'm going to connect them with the notion of a savior, going to connect them with a climactic battle, going to connect them with there's a betrayer, going to connect them with who are the violent true believers that are going to fight to the death for the cause, who are the iconic sheroes, that the women who get elevated into the story in certain ways, and then ultimately, what's the resurrection? Now, this is mildly sacrilegious to do this, but it so fits that it has to be named and certainly understood as where the Confederacy lost cause gains its juice in American society, is by the ability to hit these marks in a way that feels very familiar to people, because Christianity is such an embedded story in American life that it feels resonant. It feels what sociologists call resonant, culturally resonant, in ways that we don't psychologically get, but nonetheless feels familiar. Finally, there's a holy text to finish it off too. There's a holy text. Okay, who's the savior in Christianity? Clearly the savior in Christianity is Jesus. That's the argument. Who's the Confederacy in the lost cause? It's Robert E. Lee. He's the savior. He's the savior in the lost cause. He's the one. He's not up on a cross. He's up on a horse. Jesus is up on a cross. Robert Lee's up on a horse. Same thing. Same idea. The savior, closer to God. What's the climactic battle in Christianity? It's Armageddon. It's the final battle between good and evil. All right. What's the climactic battle in the Confederacy lost cause narrative? It's Gettysburg. It's what's called the high water mark of the Confederacy, that they actually get through Union lines in Pennsylvania. But it only lasts for a little bit of time. And ultimately, it doesn't work because there's a betrayer. There's a betrayer in the midst. So who's the betrayer in Christianity? It's this dude named Judas, right? He's the one of the apostles, the 12, who betrays Jesus in the Christianity narrative. In the Confederacy lost cause, it's this guy, General Longstreet, James E. Longstreet. He hasn't, for most Americans, risen to the level of familiarity. But as for someone like myself who lives in this space, Longstreet is an epically interesting character, an epically interesting figure in the space. Longstreet is the right-hand man of Robert E. Lee. There's two right-hand men for Robert E. Lee. The first dies in battle, Stonewall Jackson. The second is Longstreet. And Longstreet is there at Gettysburg with Lee, and he does not agree with Lee's plan. He disagrees with Lee. When it comes to a key moment on the second, the third day, Longstreet is thought to have moved his troops slower than he could have moved them because of his disagreement with Lee. And so ultimately, Longstreet is seen as betraying Lee's vision and betraying Lee. And this is a picture of James Longstreet, who is standing back at Gettysburg. This is in 1873. I think we're gonna specifically figure out. No, maybe it's 1880, 1890. I don't know. Second lecture, I got it in there with the specific dates. But this is Longstreet back there at Gettysburg. But you know who Longstreet's standing here with? He's standing with the Union. All right. And that is absolutely treasonous to the Southerners, because after the war, Longstreet was seen as not only the betrayer of Lee at Gettysburg, he becomes a Republican in the American South and supports voting rights for Black men. He's the ultimate Judas in this story. And so he's so despised by the lost cause leaders, teachers, believers, that when you go to the Gettysburg battlefield, there are markers and monuments everywhere on the Gettysburg battlefield. It's marked. Everything is marked. Here's where so-and-so fought in this battle. And here's the 116th Maryland and the 92nd Maine, 120th Minnesota Regiment. And then on the Confederate side, the same thing. They are marked like just everywhere. Longstreet never had a marker there until about a decade ago. No monument, no marker, because each side got to pick who they wanted to honor. And the Confederates didn't want to honor Longstreet. Eventually, the historians of Gettysburg say we need a marker that honors Longstreet, or at least recognizes Longstreet in this battle, because we're recognizing everybody else. And so the Confederate side, the Southern history side, Southern heritage side, Southern white heritage side said, fine, we'll put them in the woods. And so there is a statue of Longstreet that's literally in the woods, separate from all of the other Confederate markers. And you have to go off the road to the side to find Longstreet. He's buried over here on the side. He became such a betrayer and traitor in the Lost Cause story. Who's the violent true believers? For Christianity, it's the Crusaders. You go out and fight in the Crusades and kill everybody who doesn't agree with you. For the Confederacy Lost Cause, who's the violent true believers? It's clearly the Klan. The Klan is the updated version of the Crusaders. In fact, that's why they burn crosses. Okay? They burn crosses in order to bring about that same terror, to say that Christianity is, they're carrying it forward. Who's the iconic heroes? In Christianity, it's Mary, mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, the first one to find Jesus's body at the tomb. They're the females that get elevated in the Christian story, not as per se leaders, but as key figures in it. In the Confederacy Lost Clause, it's the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They're the ones that step in to carry forward the story and to promulgate the Lost Cause and put it all over the country, all over the world, through markers, through monuments, through textbooks. They become ultimately the heroes of this cause, the ones who carry on the struggle after the men in their lives could no longer do that. What's the resurrection in Christianity? It's Jesus. Jesus is going to die and he's going to rise again in Christianity. That's the resurrection. In the Confederacy Lost Cause, the resurrection is the South died and it's going to rise again. So the South was beaten, but it's going to rise again. This is where you get the South will rise again. And then finally, what's the holy text for Christianity? Well, clearly it's the Bible, and especially the New Testament of the Bible. What's the holy text in the Confederacy Lost Clause? We could say it's Pollard's book, The Lost Cause book, Lost Cause Regained, but I really think it's the Bible, actually. That's the term, that's the holy scripture that they refer to in justifying enslavement, in justifying racial power, male dominance, in justifying all of these structures that exist today that should not be changed because it's God's will. So the reason the Confederacy Lost Cause wins as a narrative, and the reasons that narratives win have a lot to do with the ability to build upon existing stories in ways that feel familiar, but ultimately aren't exactly the same, but they feel familiar. That's how narratives win. Is you take something that feels familiar and you put something else, you modify it slightly, and all of a sudden, before you know it, we're believing and buying into the new thing without really understanding why, but it just felt very comfortable and familiar. So the resonance of the Confederacy Lost Cause is deeply, deeply built upon the narrative mythology of Christianity. Okay, last little bit here is the adoption. How did this idea get adopted so widespread? Well, it comes through two methodologies. The first is through a set of markers and memorials and schools and courthouses and statues that are put up around the American South. This is a Southern Poverty Law Center figure, which shows by color the markers and the monuments around the United States that invoke and glamorize, honor the Confederacy. The green little circles are schools that are named after one another. You can see in Washington State, there used to be a school right in the middle in Wenatchee, the Robert E. Lee School. That's not there anymore, but in 2016, it was there when the report was last issued. There are courthouses all around the South that have the Confederate soldier in the front yard. And then there are all kinds of other sites like parks and roads and buildings and places where of honoring. And those are, all of this is predominantly in the former American South. But when you institutionalize things so substantially, you create an educational and a cultural system that enables these folks to carry it out with a certain level of confidence and certainty. And it is the great migrations over the next 60 to 80 years, first of African Americans and then of white Southerners out of the American South to the North and to the West, that brings these ideas across the country and embeds them. There's been some great political science research that has looked at Trump's levels of support in county by county around the country, and they've found a strong relationship in between how many Southern-born people going back like 2 generations live in a county and the level of Trump support, that the higher Southern-born history in counties around the country is correlated with stronger Trump support, MAGA Nation support. In the United States, in Washington State, there's an orange dot, and that refers to Jefferson Davis Highway. Jefferson Davis Highway, which was built all the way across the South and then up the West Coast. It was kind of the equivalent of Route 66. Goes all the way to from the Mexico to the Canadian border. And in the Seattle area, that is Aurora State Highway 99. It's not called the Jefferson Davis Highway anymore in this area, but that's what that road was, Jefferson Davis Highway. So one of the ways this was adopted was to put these things, embed them in the American South in such strong cultural and institutional ways that these folks then went out. They went out like evangelists to keep the Christian narrative metaphor going. They went out like evangelists and took it around the world. And when they did so, they were supported by the textbooks that the United Daughters of the Confederacy fought so hard to tell the narrative of the sovereign South, who are noble whites fighting on behalf of individual freedoms, who are the victims of a tyrannical federal government, and we're merely trying to seek the restoration of the rightness of the world. There are several books that have been written about how this process unfolded. All of these are books that over the last couple decades have spoke to the ways in which the United States is deeply Southern at its core, that the South won the larger battle, even though it lost the war. You might be familiar with Heather Cox Richardson's book. Exactly, it says this, how the South won the Civil War. This Imani Perry book is about a set of essays about the ways in which understanding the United States, you have to really go to the American South to understand the US. And then this is a book that is one of those books that is in my top 5 most important books that I've ever read. Freedom's Dominion. It's a 2023 book. Jefferson Cowie is a professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And it's a book about the ways in which white Southerners defined freedom, and the way they took that definition of freedom, spread it across the country, and embodied and implanted it in notions of what it means to be free. Essentially, white freedom defined in certain ways in this country, coming out of the Confederacy through the massive resistance to Jim Crow, through the architecture of George Wallace, all the way to Trump era, the Make America Great Again era. I recommend all these books. All of these are really books. I've read them all. They're all compelling. They've all taught me different pieces about the way in which the United States has become a Southern nation. I want to finish here today and bring this lecture to the moment, the moment of insurrection, and to link the 19th to the 21st centuries, from the Confederacy and the scaling and the firing on Fort Sumter to the scaling and the attempt to overtake the Capitol on January 6th. They weren't there because they just happened to be there. They were there for a cause. They had been taught that the cause that they were there for had been stolen by unfair federal government bureaucrats and scandalous and corrupt Democrats. And when they got there, they made clear to make their point about the America that they want. And this image of this guy walking through the Capitol with the battle flag of the Confederacy captures it. And so Liz Cheney, who was one of the two co-chairs of the January 6th Commission, in May of this year, when interviewed, said that when she saw the Confederate flag flying in the Capitol on January 6th, she said, this cannot be happening in the United States of America. And I want to play just a short clip from this interview when Liz Cheney is talking about that moment when she was in the Capitol and she saw this happening.
Seeing them in their exhaustion, and they'd been through hand-to-hand combat, and people died, and the notion that the notion that this was somehow a tourist event is disgraceful and despicable. And I won't be part of whitewashing what happened on January 6th. Nobody should be part of it, and people ought to be held accountable.
What was your experience on that day during the riot? Did you feel like you were in danger?
One thing I will never forget, I was on the aisle, and I looked across the aisle. Jamie Raskin was sitting on the other side of the aisle, and you could hear the mob coming. And he looked at me, and he showed me his phone, and he said, "Liz, there's a Confederate flag flying in the rotunda." And that moment of, this cannot be happening in the United States of America.
Liz, of course, is Liz's mom, Dick Cheney's wife. Liz Cheney, operating as a patriot today, endorsing and campaigning for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. It can be happening. In fact, the confederation of the American political space has been going on ever since before the Civil War. Trump didn't create it. He's very effectively perfected it. But those resonances that I talked about in this lecture, the resonances, the deep, profound ways that the lost cause builds this narrative that takes the reality of enslavement and white dominance, and puts a wrapping around that is much more palatable and acceptable and becomes convincing to many, many people. And then the cultural determination to embed those sets of ideas in markers, monuments, institutions around this country, particularly in the South, to give it a stronghold out of which it launches, is exactly the way you would win. I mean, you would build a insurgent political campaign. You start out of a certain space, get true believers, get them on board, teach them that their way of the world is the only way, and then you expand from there. George Wallace laid the groundwork for this in the 1960s. That'll be lecture 2, okay? And then Donald Trump picked it up in the 2000s and took it the whole distance. And that's why we're fighting it today. And that's why there was a Confederate flag in this Capitol. And God knows what will happen if Donald Trump is elected again. So that's lecture 1. Tomorrow night will be lecture 2, George Wallace, and then lecture 3 on Wednesday will be Donald Trump. I'm happy if you have any questions. I'll take a look and see if there's anything in the chat. Carol Voss, you great point. You mentioned that Mark Robinson, the Confederate, I think it was Carol. Let's see here. Yeah, that the Republican nominee for the governorship in North Carolina, that he talked about wanting slavery and that he would have slaves and he would own them if he could. You know, that is absolutely the MAGA mindset. It isn't the Hitlerian perspective as much as it is the lost cause perspective, that white dominance is just a taken for granted thing. And it can be achieved through winning the narrative battles, okay, and through institutionalizing, through immigration laws, through abortion rights removal, institutionalizing these practices. I see Barbara's point here that the response is about more than just white power. It's about the notion of property, about white men being able to own property. And I wouldn't see those two as in any way not joined at the hip in American life. That the status of white men in American mythology is deeply rooted in the agrarian Jeffersonian ideals of being able to own land and make your own way, and thus to be able to own all the forms of property that let you work that land. So I agree with you that white power and land ownership, white male land ownership, are intimately combined, inexorably connected together. At the heart of MAGA Nation and at the heart of the George Wallace response to civil rights and at the heart of the Confederacy and the Age of Terror afterwards was the sense that there was a loss of the way the world should work, that white men should be in power. It should be unquestioned. It should be unchallenged. Certainly should not be challenged by women, and no way in the world should it be challenged by Black individuals. And property is at the kind of control of property, whether in human form or physical building or constructed form, is absolutely at the center of both of those. Pat asks really what is the billion-dollar question, is how does this notion about commitment to personal individual freedoms, how does that get reconciled with the commitment, with the subjugation of women and women's bodies? How do they see these two as not ultimately in fundamental contradiction? Because the individual freedoms that are fundamentally being exalted are the white male individual freedoms. This is where Cowie's book does such a tremendous job of laying bare the notions of white freedom, Southern white freedom, Southern white male freedom, as ultimately the definition of freedom that carries the South and wins the cultural battles in the American South, then gets pushed across the country and wins the definitions of freedom in this country. So yeah, Bobby, exactly that. It's white Christian male freedom. You're right. I haven't been saying the word Christian here. You're right. It's because it's so intertwined in here. I'm glad you got me to say it explicitly. It's white Christian male freedom definitions. And that notion, it's a certain version of whiteness, is a certain version of Christianity, it's a certain version of maleness. And those definitions of freedom have to fit all of those. So there's no contradiction in removing the voting rights of people of color, for example. There's no contradiction there because that's not the kinds of freedom that matter in this worldview. There's no contradiction with removing the freedoms of women to control their bodies because that, again, is not the kinds of freedoms that are being upheld and fought for. This is why men, particularly BIPOC men and working class white men and younger men, are slowly kind of peeling off from the Democratic Party towards Trump, is he runs a worldview that exactly fits what this kind of maleness, this white Christian maleness is built upon. And so Trump, even though he's not, well, I don't know what the definition of Christianity really is, but he doesn't embody what is traditionally thought to embody this. Nonetheless appeals so strongly because he hits the other markers, the white maleness power. So he hits them out of the park. All right. It's so effective. And for some chunk of Black men in our society, that sexism matters too. That appeals to them, and it is able to be enough to overcome the hostility to Black Americans that Trump manifests. So I'll finish up here. I see, whoever doesn't have a name on it, but says that they grew up in Alabama, and the narrative is the history that I was taught in history classes. It's absolutely the case. It's when you look at the textbooks, it's until really just the most recent decades where have we begun to move away from the narrative of just states' rights and sovereignty and individual freedoms of a victimized white Southern populace against this tyrannical federal government. That is the narrative that's being taught. Now there's some references to slavery, certainly, but this contestation over what can be taught in schools is at the heart of that is this notion of we don't want to lose this narrative. That's why the book bannings and the control of education in the South has been so visceral. Karen, it absolutely doesn't matter that Trump isn't really dedicated to the cause. It doesn't matter. It's just what people kind of perceive about him, the way in which he shows up and says, hey, we're going to rename Fort Liberty back to Fort Bragg. So thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. Hope to see you again tomorrow night. I'm going to get this sent out to everybody in the next couple hours. So thanks so much tonight. Let's keep the work going. We've got 29 days to go, folks. Thanks. Good night.